I saw him standing behind me. I didn't notice him entering and was completely shocked to see him here now ever. To be honest, I believed he was really dead. His sudden appearance left me speechless. Now it was really bad because I had just stepped up to the podium to give the eulogy for my husband, who lay in the coffin in front of me. Just like the last time I saw him 30 years ago, butterflies swarmed in my stomach. My breath caught and my heart skipped a beat. My gaze and silence must have aroused curiosity, because most people turned to see where I was looking. This only created more curiosity because of the many people who had gathered for the funeral. Only my little sister Elaine knew who he was. Looking at her, I realized that she did not recognize him. I found out. There was no way that I wouldn't recognize him. He just stared at me. Then his lips curled into a smile. He nodded at me, then turned and walked out of the funeral home. As Jim's wife for the past 20 years, I had to speak up. I was so shocked that I just started speaking, completely forgetting about my prepared speech. I said something stupid about Jim comforting me when I was going through a really bad time in my life. Of course, I forgot to say what caused this. I talked more nonsense about having a loving husband and raising our 2 children. I talked about the wonderful, loving relationship that we falsely portrayed. I talked about this alcoholic, unambitious loser, as you should do at a funeral. Naturally, I kept silent about all this. I even cried. It was not difficult for me to do this. No one even suspected that I wasn't crying about Jim. I cried because I saw him. I played my part well in the cemetery. I was a grieving widow who had just lost the love of my life. In truth, that's how it was. It just wasn't Jim. I was actually glad that the bastard was finally dead, and I was free of him. Unfortunately, I didn't realize what a complete fraud he was until it was too late. By that time, I had already been married to him for a couple of years and was raising our 2 children. Mallory was 5 when we got married. He adopted her. Keith arrived shortly after our wedding. I did it because I wasn't going to raise my children alone, and I had no choice. Finally, it was all over. Jim's coffin was lowered into the hole. I threw flowers and a handful of earth into it. My children helped me move away from the grave to the waiting car. I happened to look to my right and saw him standing there. He was standing a couple 100 feet away from me, leaning against a tree. My sudden stop took my children by surprise. I stumbled as they continued moving and pulled me forward. Having regained my balance, I looked again and saw him leaving. "Bobby!" I shouted. I turned and tried to run. High heels in the grass are not conducive to running. "Bobby! Please! Bobby, stop it! Please come back!" I shouted, trying to run. He never looked back. He kept walking away. "Mother, what the heck?" Mallory asked, trying to stop me. "What are you doing? Who is this man? Please, you have to stop him. I need to talk to him. I can't let him go again." "What are you talking about, Mom? Who is he, and what do you mean when you say you can't let him go again?" Mallory asked. It was already too late. I fell to my knees, sobbing as I watched him get into the pickup truck and drive away. My heart felt like it exploded when I lost him again. He wasn't dead. He was alive. It didn't make any sense. If he was alive, where was he and why did he never return home? I mourned him. I was destroyed when he disappeared. Now I was destroyed again by his sudden appearance. That was 30 years ago, give or take a few months. My wonderful husband Bobby was due to return from his business trip this evening. I had wonderful news for him, and I was cooking his favorite dinner to celebrate. There was even a bottle of Merlot waiting for me. I timed it perfectly. He was supposed to return home exactly at 6 in the evening. He'll have time to go upstairs, shower, and change before eating. I was going to tell him the great news over dinner, and then we would spend most of the evening celebrating. I even prepared some special underwear for later. 6:30 came and went. Perhaps the traffic was worse than usual. 7 draw. There may have been an accident on the freeway causing delays. 7:30. I was already starting to worry. 8 hours. Did Bobby have an accident? By midnight, I was in complete panic. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I started dial his pager number. At that time, he did not have a mobile phone. Perhaps if he had been in the hospital, someone would have noticed the pager going off and called me back. The next morning, at 8 hours, I called his office. No one saw him or heard anything about him. I contacted the police and told them I was worried because he never came home last night. They didn't have any information and they didn't have any accidents last night. I had to wait until the next day to file a missing person report. I spent the day calling all his friends and acquaintances that I knew of. Bobby has no family left. He was an only child, and his parents died a couple of years ago. Nobody knew anything. I called my little sister. I was panicking, so she came to comfort me. I kept trying to contact Bobby. Early the next morning, I was at the police station filing a missing person report. I didn't like many of the questions they asked me. They hinted that Bobby might be cheating on me and was simply staying at his mistress's house. I knew Bobby would never cheat on me. Over the next few weeks, I was terrified. My sister stayed with me and tried to keep me as calm as possible. Too much stress would be harmful to the child growing inside me. This was the news I was going to tell my loving husband. He will become a father. We have been planning and trying for some time, and it has finally happened. The only thing they told me was that they found Bobby's abandoned car at a shopping center 2 towns away. There were no other clues. I had serious financial problems for a month. I wasn't working, and Bobby's paycheck wasn't coming in anymore. His company fired him for not showing up. I used the money we had in savings to hire a private detective to find Bobby. After 2 weeks and no information, I had no money to continue. Although we had no credit card debt, we still had debt on the mortgage on our house. Since there was no money coming in, I was already 2 months behind and had no way of catching up. At that time, Jim was a godsend. He was Bobby's best friend, and we had become very close over the past few years. He continued to make sure I had food and everything I needed, but could not help with the mounting bills. Unlike Bobby, who was smart and strived for success, Jim was rather lazy and not motivated. He also wasn't as smart as Bobby. To put it bluntly, Jim had a delusion of mediocrity. The bank evicted me. Elaine only had a small 1-room apartment, so I couldn't stay there. With no real income, I couldn't afford my own apartment, but Jim rented a 2-bedroom trailer. I moved in with him. After all, he cared about me. Why didn't I try to get a job? Who will take a pregnant woman who will soon go on maternity leave? Yes, I moved into Jim's bedroom. It was a 2-bedroom mobile home, so we needed 1 bedroom for the nursery. That left either the sofa or Jim's bed. Besides, Jim took care of me. It wasn't true love, at least not for me, but at least it felt good. No, it wasn't as good as Bobby, but it wasn't that bad either. Eventually, Mallory was born. We went to every thrift store and garage sale in the area, buying everything we needed for the baby. I will say one good thing. Jim doted on Mallory. Eventually, I had to get a job as the bills kept getting bigger, and Jim lost his job again. Since I had not worked for several years, my choices were limited. Eventually, I managed to get a job as a salesman at a local department store. Over the next 5 years, I continued to try to find Bobby. I couldn't afford a private investigator, but I used what little I knew about computers to find his name and any other information I could find. I continued to pursue the police on his case, and I checked every anonymous body that turned up. I never found anything. Eventually, I ran out of options. I forced myself to accept the fact that he was dead somewhere, and I would never find him. Besides, Jim pressured me to get off my ass and move on with my life. I filed for divorce because I was abandoned. 6 months later, Jim and I got married. 6 months later, Keith was born. Over the next 2 years, everything settled into a sort of routine. I go to work. When Jim had a job, we would drop the kids off at daycare until one of us left work to pick them up. When Jim got off work, he looked after them until I got home. I had my tubes tied when Keith was born, so we didn't have to worry about having more children. Jim started drinking more when Keith was 2 years old. It became obvious that I really didn't love him and never would. He found it more difficult to find and then keep a job. When Keith was 5 years old, I first discovered that he was cheating on me. I ignored it. I also ignored the second betrayal. Then, I ignored everyone else. We have pretty much become more like roommates than husband and wife. We had sex sometimes, but it was just an exercise to relieve stress. Over time, I really began to despise him. Looking back, I'm pretty sure I, subconsciously, blamed him for all my problems. We never had much money and always seemed to be struggling to survive. I tried my best, but I was very unhappy. However, I did my best to raise my children well. I think the kids were fine, but I couldn't help but compare my new life to the one I had with Bobby. Jim's drinking and lifestyle finally caught up with him. He was in pretty bad shape by the time his heart decided he'd had enough and gave up. Elaine finally married a decent man a few years ago, and they bought a nice house to raise their 2 daughters. Mallory had graduated from college and was working her way up the corporate ladder. Keith decided to join the Navy after graduating from high school, and things went well for him. We just returned to my sister's house after the funeral. I had no desire to return to the rundown mobile home just yet. Besides, after what happened at the cemetery, it was quite obvious that I was unable to be alone. "What the fuck, Ellie? What's happened? Who are you yelling at?" Elaine asked, sitting me down on the sofa. "Bobby. My Bobby was there. Bobby is dead. He died 30 years ago. No, he was at the funeral home, then back to the cemetery. Listen, Ellie, it's been a long, stressful day. It just seemed to you, having lost your husband after 25 years, your mind just plays tricks on you and hallucinates images of the past. You just want to believe that Bobby is there and will come back for you. No, damn it. He was there. He's still alive." He grinned at me as well as he knew something I don't know. "Mom, who is he and why is he so important?" Mallory asked. "He's your father, honey. He was my first husband and the love of my life." "What? But you always... I thought... How can this be?" She stuttered. "Well, where was he all this time?" asked Keith. "I don't know. It's just that one day he never returned home. We all thought he was dead. A week passed before I could bring myself to return to the mobile home. I knew Bobby was out there somewhere. Everyone else thought I was just imagining things. No one could explain who the man in the back of the funeral home was, but they didn't believe it was Bobby. I knew differently. Life is back to normal as it can be. Some friends sometimes pressured me to stop after work and have a drink or two. I was quite attractive for my age and was approached from time to time, but I always turned them down. Since then, I decided to remain celibate. I knew Bobby was there and he would be my one and only. I didn't have anyone else. This was a year later. One evening, I returned from work. I opened the door and entered. I almost fell when I suddenly stopped. Bobby was sitting there on the couch. Bobby? I muttered. "Hello, Ellie. Are you here? This is true. Where were you and why did you disappear?" "You know why?" "No, I do not know. You just never returned home from your trip. You disappeared. I thought you were dead." "I was dead. Sure, my heart was beating and I was breathing, but everything else was dead." "I don't understand." "Ellie, do you remember the last time I returned home from a business trip?" "Of course I remember. I always remember how you returned home from a trip. We always made love all night, and the next day you stayed home to recover." "No, Ellie. The last time I came home, this was my last trip. You didn't come home. I waited all night, but you didn't come home. It was a Thursday night, and I cooked a special dinner to tell you the great news, but you still didn't come home. But I'm back home, Ellie. I asked if you remember, but you don't remember. You don't remember how I came home because I came home on Wednesday, not Thursday. Now, do you remember? He told me what happened after he came home and found me in bed with Jim. He told me about the pain he felt because of our betrayal. He told me how his spirit died right then and how he left. He told me about the 2 years he lived on the streets before he woke up from his sadness and began to move on. He told me about how he felt like he had lost everything he cared about, especially when he heard me tell Jim that he was actually the father of his daughter. He said he began hiding his name and took his mother's maiden name while he created a new life for himself. He changed jobs and constantly moved from place to place. He kept up to date with my life out of curiosity. He knew about the divorce from a public notice in the newspaper. A few years after this, he met another woman and eventually got married. They had 3 children, who by that time were almost grown. I was so filled with remorse that I couldn't bring myself to tell him the one important thing I needed. I just couldn't hurt him again. When he left, I simply closed myself off from remorse and grief. It was 2 days later when my sister found me in a catatonic state on my couch. I haven't moved since Bobby left last night. I couldn't bring myself to act. I was severely dehydrated and didn't eat anything. She couldn't get me to answer. I just sat there, staring into space. She finally called Mallory to help her get me into the car and take me to her house. My clothes were a mess, so Mallory grabbed a couple changes of clothes and followed Elaine home. Together they washed me and dressed me in the underwear and sweatpants that Mallory grabbed. Then they sat me down on the sofa. They managed to pour some water into my mouth for me to drink. The only reaction I had was an occasional tear running down my cheek. I sat there for several hours before I finally started to come to my senses. "Ellie?" Elaine asked. "My God, what happened to you?" "It was Bobby. He came to me." "You mean in a dream?" "No, he was at my house when I arrived." "Ellie, Bobby is dead. You have to accept this." "He didn't die, at least physically. He knew. He caught me and I never knew about it." "What do you mean he caught you, Mom?" Mallory asked. He returned home and I never saw him again. I didn't know." "I don't understand. You waited all night and never saw him come home?" "No, not that night. He returned home the night before. He returned home a day early and I didn't see him." "What are you talking about?" "I had an affair with Jim. Bobby came home a day early to find Jim having sex with me in our bed. We didn't even notice. He heard me tell Jim that he was actually Mallory's father. Bobby just quietly walked away and disappeared. He was alive all this time. He just left me." "Then where the hell has he been all this time?" "Wait a minute. So, if you were having an affair with Jim back then, why did you tell me Bobby was my father? You always told everyone that Jim was my biological father." "I said this because it was easier. Jim helped us and it made him happy. Either way, the chances were 50-50. I didn't tell anyone that a few years ago I took a DNA test and it was confirmed that you were Bobby's daughter. I was leaving the grave after my mother's funeral. Mom was never the same after Bobby talked to her that night. As far as I knew, she never heard from him again. I tried several times to find him and talk to him, but to no avail. Mom never went on dates. She had offers, but she rejected them all. She stopped living and simply existed. Even being close to her grandchildren hardly brought her out of her sadness. I heard her mutter something one day about how she wished she could share this time with her husband. I knew she wasn't thinking about Jim. My husband and 3 children and I were returning to the car when I saw him. He was older than I remembered, but that was to be expected. After telling my husband that I wouldn't be long, I turned and walked up to him. "Are you Bobby?" "Yes," he answered. "Why are you here?" "Isn't it obvious?" She was my soulmate. I have always loved her and always will. "Then why did you leave?" "Do you love your husband?" "Certainly." "Imagine that one day you will come home and find him in your bed with your best friend. Then imagine that she tells him that she is pregnant with his child. What would you do?" I didn't have an answer to this. They were 2 people in this world that I could rely on for everything. They destroyed everything I believed in. I had to leave before I destroyed myself and them too. I eventually got through it, but it took a couple of years. Now I have a different life. I have a wife and 3 adult children. I had to come to pay my respects to the woman who once meant more to me than life itself. I'm sorry for your loss. And although I haven't said it before, I'm also sorry for the loss of your father a few years ago. With these words, he turned to leave. I extended my hand to stop him. When he turned around, I said, "Mom lied. My father is not dead, and I would like to have the opportunity to get to know him a little." A sad smile appeared on his face. He took my hand and carefully removed it from his shoulder. "Being a father requires a lot more than just donating sperm. You look like a wonderful lady. Your parents obviously raised you right. It is best not to touch a sleeping dog. Now that my Ellie is gone, maybe I can finally find some peace. Goodbye, Mallory." May you and your husband have a long, happy life together." With these words, he left. I never saw him again. Several years later, I learned of his death. I actually attended the funeral. I listened to his wife, son, 2 daughters, and several friends talk about what a wonderful person he was. They also talked about the bouts of deep sadness he was going through. He never spoke about the reasons for his sadness, but after a couple of days, he came to his senses. No one talked about his life before coming to this city, and no one seemed to know anything about his past. I stayed in the back seat so as not to interfere. It was late evening. The funeral was long over, and workers had already filled up his grave. I sat on a small bench near his grave and cried about the losses caused by the stupidity of 2 people a long time ago. If my mother and my father's best friend had not had an affair— "Are you okay?" A female voice was heard behind me. I turned around and saw that it was Bobby's daughter. "I will," I answered. "I saw you at Dad's funeral, but I don't recognize you." "How do you know him?" To tell the truth, I barely knew him. In fact, I only spoke to him once in my life. I asked to give me the opportunity to get to know him better, but he refused. "If you only talked to him once, why did you come to his funeral? Do you remember his attacks of sadness? They were at least partially caused by me. See, I talked to him at my mother's funeral. He was married to my mother, but he thought that I was not his daughter. I came to the funeral to pay tribute to my biological father. 2 people gave in to their desires. The pain they caused turned into decades of pain and sadness for themselves and others. My mother and father spent decades repenting over the destruction of their marriage, the loss of deep friendships, and the loss of the one true love in my mother's life. My father suffered from the loss of his soulmate, his best friend, and his daughter. Now I suffer from the fact that I never really knew my father. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.